This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At our Virtual Defence and Security Studies gathering of March 24th, Dr. Vivian McAlister of the University of Western Ontario addressed the crucial importance of the pharmaceutical supply chain in times of global health crisis and discussed what Canada must do to take full control of our sources as a matter of national security.
I'm Dr. Daniel Eustace, Director of the RCMI Defense and Security Studies Program. Tonight, we are extremely pleased to have as our guest speaker, Dr. Vivian McAlister. Dr. McAlister had spoken to the RCMI previously, and I was very happy when he offered at short notice to present his thoughts on the timely and extremely important subject of essential pharmaceutical and vaccine supply as a matter of national security. Now, at first, I was interested in why Dr. McAlister wanted to videotape his presentation for tonight until I realized that he's actually sitting up on duty in Moose Factory, Northern Ontario, where he is currently the locum surgeon for a very large region, helping out during the Easter break. So he was kind enough to videotape his presentation so that in the event he didn't have enough connectivity from that relatively remote place, we could still hear what he had to say on this important subject. So thanks a lot, Dr. McAlister, for doing that. It was a great idea. Fortunately, he is able to be with us. We will listen to his presentation, and then at the end of it, we'll have that opportunity to pose questions to him. Please do not hesitate to use the chat function or the Q&A function throughout his presentation, and I will moderate those questions at the appropriate time. This presentation is about 40 minutes long. For those of you who are not familiar with Dr. McAlister, he's a surgeon at the University Hospital in London, Ontario, and also a former member of the Canadian Armed Forces Medical Service. He retired in the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and was Chief of General Surgery. I had previously characterized him as the General Surgeon General, which is a significantly higher rank level, but one that I'm sure he could have attained with absolutely no difficulty had he chosen to do so. And I should also note that he deployed overseas, particularly to Afghanistan, on multiple occasions, which was one of the subjects of one of his previous talks. I can't end my introduction of Dr. McAlister without mentioning the fact that he was recently admitted into the Order of Canada in the rank of officer. Dr. McAlister, congratulations on that honor. Well done and well deserved indeed. Sylvia, if I may, I would like now to introduce Dr. Vivian McAlister's presentation.
Thank you, Dan, for that very kind introduction. And thank you for organizing this series so well. It's an honor to take part. I'm very grateful to the group for allowing me to present, and I look forward to their discussion of this topic, which I think is very important. I propose that the supply of our essential medicines and vaccines is a matter of national security for Canada. I came to this topic a few years ago when I encountered shortages of commonly available drugs in the hospital. They were euphemistically said to be on back order. And as more and more of these common drugs went on back order, I realized that it was not simply a matter of hospital inefficiency, but that this problem affected all hospitals in Canada, and that the drugs that seemed to be on back order were those that did not provide the same amount of profit for their manufacturer, and more expensive alternatives were available. I thought that possibly greater forces were at play and that it might be necessary to consider our drug supply as a matter of national security to be able to counter those forces, as they were beyond the capability of any single hospital and probably any province. Well, this situation arose, of course, with the pandemic, and initially it was with PPE. And the Prime Minister immediately considered the Emergencies Act. He arranged a teleconference with the premiers of the province to discuss this issue. Well, we were all very frightened at that time. In London, we were concerned that we would face the same result that occurred in Detroit, where the medical system was overwhelmed by large numbers of patients who were severely ill with COVID-19. And we constructed this field hospital in the local agriplex. We used horse stalls as dividers between patient care areas. The Emergencies Act came into effect in 1988, and it gives the federal government sweeping powers to regulate or prohibit travel, to requisition and use property, to compel expert individuals to provide essential services, to regulate the distribution of goods, resources, and service, and to establish emergency shelters and hospitals. The government felt the act might be required to divert masks, ventilators, and COVID-19 testing devices to areas of greatest need. Prime Minister Trudeau said he would use all tools at his disposal to deal with the pandemic. And he said that the Emergencies Act had a key element in that it was an override over the provinces. It takes powers that are normally only in the hands of the provinces or even the municipalities and puts them in the federal level, he said. Well, in this presentation, I'd like you to consider several issues. Should we take a restricted or an expanded view of national security? How do we navigate the jurisdictions of healthcare delivery regarding federal government and the provincial government? Should we have a supply chain, a manufacturing chain, a storage capability, or a combination of all three? Should Health Canada confine its input to regulation, or should it be involved in supply? Pharmacare is the way that a small group of our population, mainly those over 65, get access to drugs outside of hospitals. And should pharmacare be extended to all citizens? Emergency powers are rarely invoked in Canada, especially in comparison to the United States and other countries. And should emergency powers be restricted for emergencies, or should we be able to use them to prepare for emergencies? Finally, once the war is over and the celebrations die down and the pandemic becomes a distant memory, our selected memory of this period will rob us of the opportunity to learn important lessons. Now, it is not my intent to appear critical of our governments in this presentation. On the contrary, I think that our leaders, federal and provincial leaders, have exhibited a level of collaboration that will be favorably remembered in comparison to their predecessors and prior crises. They have played their hand as well as can be played, given that the deck of cards has been robbed of its aces. Bill C-59 governs matters of national security in Canada. It was passed in 2017 after 2 years of consultations, which were summarized in this report. And you can see from the table of contents that the national security is focused almost entirely on terrorism. There's only a brief mention of cyber terrorism at the end. And if we undertook those consultations today, we might have changed the emphasis so that cyber terrorism is now considered a greater threat. However, it is very unlikely that we would include healthcare in our consideration of national security. On the other hand, for a broader definition of national security, you only have to go to any dictionary. And here a definition supplied by Wikipedia, I think, is excellent, in that it is the security and defense of a nation state, including its citizens, economy, and institutions, which is regarded as a duty of government. Now, even if you took the restricted view of national security, you would have to say that healthcare is a target. Hospitals and their information systems have already been attacked by criminals, mainly using denial of service techniques to extort ransoms. And it is believed that these criminals have connections to state actors such as North Korea, Russia, and China. And it would not take much for them to turn their attention to our healthcare system if an overt conflict occurred as part of a diversionary tactic or to demoralize us and weaken our resolve. Healthcare, of course, is one of the primary targets in conflicts today. In Afghanistan, we witnessed the assassinations of doctors, attacks on hospitals, and this hospital, the military hospital in Kabul, is where I served with the Canadian Armed Forces a few years before this attack, when ISIS gunmen dressed as medics infiltrated security and killed 30 members of staff and patients. But the situation is much worse in Syria, where states have now used their power to target healthcare in their conflict. Over a 12-hour period in 2017, Russia supported the Syrian government in bombing 4 hospitals in the area occupied by their opponents. Of course, they do it to undermine the resolve of their antagonists, because they know that healthcare is a critical element of security. That said, I don't think threats to Canadian healthcare are external at the moment. The vulnerabilities we face are structural. And of those, I think drug shortage is one of our most critical vulnerabilities. This website was started by a group of concerned doctors in 2011, and they continue to update it. It contains the most detailed information regarding drug shortage, with far more information than a similar website dedicated to the same topic hosted by Health Canada. The doctors, led by physician Jackie Duffin of Kingston, wrote to the Prime Minister just before the pandemic in an open letter to describe the problem. They outlined that at that time, and it's probably worse now, Canada was chronically short of 1,700 medications that were routinely used to deliver good health care until that time. They also pointed out our weakness in the fact that all of our medications are made abroad, or most of our medications are made abroad, and those that we make at home, mainly by generic companies, use critical components that are made abroad. Well, Canada's faced drug shortages in the past, and how did we deal with them? What can we learn from those incidents? In the late 1880s, there was an outbreak of smallpox, and vaccine that we had imported from the United States for nearly 100 years was no longer available because they were suffering from outbreaks of smallpox at the same time. So we responded by making our own. The Ontario Vaccine Farm was started by Dr. Alexander Stewart with the help of the newly formed Ontario Board of Health. And they raised smallpox vaccine in cows. And they continued to supply smallpox vaccine for the next 30 years. In 1916, the Ontario Vaccine Farm was transferred to the antitoxin laboratory at the University of Toronto. Now, to understand why this established facility was transferred to a newly formed facility, you have to go back to 1914. And of course, what happened then was the First World War. And early on, the Parliament passed the War Measures Act to allow Cabinet to govern using orders in council during the emergency. It was invoked until January 1920, and it was used during both world wars to regulate industrial and agricultural production, as well as to control public order. Interestingly, in the Second World War, it was necessary to establish the Wartime Trade and Prices Board as well, because they were deeply concerned about profiteering, which had occurred in the First World War, and they were concerned about inflation, which dogged the 1930s. The act was replaced by the Emergencies Act, which we have just discussed. Now, the War Measures Act was used to transfer the Ontario Vaccine Farm to the antitoxin laboratory in Toronto. The history of the antitoxin laboratory goes back to the same period as the Ontario Vaccine Farm, where in Europe at that time, Louis Pasteur discovered rabies vaccine, and he brought vaccinology into the modern era. 5 years later, diphtheria antitoxin was discovered in Germany. Now, it was available, and diphtheria antitoxin was available in Canada as an import from the United States, but it was so expensive, it was not really available to patients who were sick, and many patients died difficult deaths as a consequence of not getting access to that medication. Dr. J.G. Fitzgerald was a psychiatrist in Toronto at the time, and he changed gears and went to Europe and studied bacteriology in the Pasteur Institute in Brussels, and he learned how to make diphtheria antitoxin. When he returned to Toronto, he resolved to make it cheaply so that it would be available to care for patients. And having demonstrated that he could do it, he gained the support of the University of Toronto and wealthy patrons in Toronto to create a facility on Steeles Avenue that became Connaught Laboratories. They made the antitoxin to diphtheria, and they did provide it all across the country to combat that disease. But very quickly, the First World War came along, and a new demand for medications was there. The Connaught Laboratories met that. They developed tetanus antitoxin and typhoid vaccine, and they ramped up production to supply the Canadian forces and the Allies throughout the First World War. Now, this website is actually hosted by Sanofi Pasteur, and I recommend it as a wonderful history of a description of this history. And we'll just follow the website through the era. The Connaught Laboratories were running so well that in the 1920s, when insulin became available through the work of Banting, Best, MacLeod, and Collomb, they were able to not only refine and produce insulin, but also to develop the ancillary tests that are required to make it a viable clinical treatment. They also expanded their vaccine production throughout this period. In the 1940s, they ramped up to supply the Canadian forces and the Allies throughout the Second World War. They not only expanded the range of medicines that they made, but they were able to meet new requirements, such as the production of penicillin when it was developed. And their supplies supported the campaign in Europe of the Allies, and then the early rollout of penicillin for the civilian population. They also took part in the development of polio vaccine. It is forgotten now, but they were critical to the success of the campaigns in the 1950s, because they developed the tissue culture, which allowed the polio virus to grow, and they provided the substrate to Salk and Sabin to create their vaccines. They collaborated with Salk to produce and distribute the Salk vaccine, and they continued to supply new drugs along the way. Interestingly, they had tried to develop a flu vaccine as early as 1918 during the pandemic of Spanish flu, to which we often refer today, given our own experiences. But Asian flu and other pandemics occurred, and they tried to make vaccines against it and other infections. They continued to supply smallpox vaccine, and they became the reference center for the WHO smallpox eradication program. And indeed, the last patient with smallpox was treated in Toronto in the 1960s. In 1989, they became the North American division of Pasteur Mérieux in a merger, which was known as Pasteur Mérieux Connaught. In the 1990s, the government and the universities started to divest themselves of property. I'm not sure what the reason was, whether it was philosophical or whether it was to capitalize on savings of the past. But this Connaught Laboratories was bought by multinational drug companies, and through a series of purchases and mergers, they became Sanofi Pasteur, which they are today. This website is hosted by Sanofi Pasteur as their legacy project, claiming all of the contributions of the past that I described. And while they continue to make medicines at the Toronto campus of Sanofi Pasteur, their vision for the future is not very inspiring, going by their website. Now, the situation for the Prime Minister got dramatically worse when President Trump sought to invoke the Defense Production Act and extend its effect by halting the delivery of supplies to Canada from 3M made outside of the United States, and hoping to divert them to the United States instead. We in Canada have 3M plants. We have one in London. And as far as I know, the plant in London does not make any products that are used in the pandemic. 3M pointed out to President Trump that it would be very disruptive because almost certainly Canada and other countries would have to respond with their own Emergencies Act and direct 3M to start making pandemic supplies in country. They promised to supply the United States with their needs from the current arrangements, and the Defense Production Act was not invoked in this instance. However, the prospect of it alarmed governments in Canada and around the world. The Defense Production Act was invoked by President Trump in December when the vaccines became available, with an order to ensure that American citizens would have first priority to receive American vaccines. But it is not an idiosyncrasy of President Trump to use the Defense Production Act in this way. It is used frequently by the American governments. Indeed, one of the first acts of President Biden was to issue an executive order regarding sustainable public health supply chain. And he said the order used the Defense Production Act to ensure that supplies would remain available to the federal and state governments, to local, tribal, and territorial authorities, to America's healthcare workers, health systems, and patients. Now, at the same time, and in fact, actually on the same day, Pfizer informed Canada that there would be an interruption in the supply of vaccine to this country and elsewhere because of a planned upgrade for their facility in Belgium. No explanation has ever been given why they planned the upgrade during the surge in production and why it was not ready for the surge in advance. They also replied to Premier Ford when he suggested that they should make the vaccine for us at the plant in Michigan, which is only an hour and a half by road from our border, when they claimed that the Defence Production Act would prevent them from doing this. I'm not certain that their explanation was correct because fortunately the supplies from Moderna were not interrupted and planned supplies from Johnson & Johnson are not interrupted by the Defence Production Act. Premier Ford, I think, expressed all of our opinions on that day. But let's look at the Defence Production Act. It replaced acts that were used by the American governments in the Second World War in particular to ramp up production to meet that emergency. But the Act, in its long title, gives a very good description that it is designed to establish a system of priorities and allocations for materials and facilities, authorize the requisitioning thereof, provide financial assistance for expansion of productive capacity and supply, provide for price and wage stabilization, provide for settlement of labor disputes, strengthen controls over credit, and by these measures facilitate the production of goods and services necessary for national security. Interestingly, the wording is almost identical to our Emergencies Act, with the exception that they do not provide for the emergency, but they provide for national security. This act has been invoked many times since it was passed. And most recently, it was used by President Biden to order Merck to manufacture the Johnson & Johnson vaccine at one of its facilities in order to have sufficient supplies. Indeed, Canada might well benefit from this invocation of the Defence Production Act in receiving some of those supplies. Now, as I showed you, Sanofi Pasteur currently own Connaught laboratories that had made such significant contributions to drug shortages in Canada and also to eradication programs and beneficial programs around the world. And if Sanofi had decided to make COVID-19 vaccine in Toronto, and we had bet on that horse, we might actually be in a worse position than we currently are. Sanofi have two vaccines that they were attempting to develop for COVID-19. The first, based on their flu vaccine, did not work out. The second, using the exact same system as Pfizer and Moderna, in which they collaborated with biotech companies to use mRNA, also have stalled. So unless we would have done it differently, had they been doing it in Canada, we would be in a difficult situation if we had bet entirely on Sanofi's COVID-19 vaccine. In fact, the reliance on Sanofi's vaccine is one of the explanations for why France is so far behind the United Kingdom with respect to the vaccine rollout. So it is not entirely a panacea to use national security, and a broad approach is required, as was taken by our governments. However, not making vaccine at home remains a vulnerability. And there are efforts now to try and rectify that. An mRNA vaccine that was developed in Montreal will now be manufactured in Calgary, and Manitoba, and to some extent the federal government, are now supporting its creation. And interestingly, Manitoba not only pre-purchased some vaccine to support it, but they also offered to undertake clinical trials of the vaccine, which I think highlights another element of a contribution that you can make in this field. Just quickly going to turn our attention to profiteering. Whenever there's a shortage, those that meet the shortage have a position of great power. And profiteering is often considered merely in financial terms. Indeed, those companies that produce the vaccines that we will use against COVID-19 will be very handsomely rewarded. Pfizer stand to make billions and billions of dollars. But profiteering also has another face in which those who control the supplies in the shortage have the ability to exert undue influence. And Pfizer Canada was extraordinarily tone deaf when, during the shortage of the interruption of supply of the vaccine that I described earlier, they approached the Prime Minister in an effort to reduce their tax liability in the next budget. And they have done even worse things abroad. In countries where they do not have great faith that the deaths that will be ramped up for the vaccine will be met, they have asked for collateral from those countries, not within the country, but of property outside the country, mainly their embassies in desirable locations around the world. Now, Canada has had a fraught relationship with large drug companies for a long time. I described the 1914 War Measures Act and how we met some of our requirements. We had quite a burgeoning drug manufacturing industry at that time, and they banded together to form the Association of Manufacturers of Medicines and Toilet Products. And this association has changed its name slightly over the years. They dropped the toilet products pretty quickly. They became the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada, and now they are Innovative Medicines Canada. The drug companies were in leadership positions throughout the 20th century, and they are now the basis of many of the multinational drug companies that we are familiar with. In the 1960s until 1987, we had an act of parliament that permitted compulsory license of patented pharmaceuticals under certain conditions in return for a 4% royalty, which was considered fair reward. It was proposed and championed by Pierre Trudeau, but he remained under constant pressure from the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association of Canada, trying to rescind the act. Any efforts to modify it by increasing the term of the patent or increasing the royalty were met with frosty rebuttals, because they really wanted the act rescinded, and not because of the effect of its market on Canada, in Canada, but the effect of Canada on the United States, where Congressman Waxman and others looked to Canada with envy at our compulsory license law, and they sought to introduce it into the United States. He didn't succeed in that, but he did succeed in having a law passed in 1984 that facilitated the development of generic companies who could make these drugs once the patent had expired. In the 1990s, we had been promised, if the compulsory license law was rescinded, that there would be increased investment in the production of innovative medicines in Canada. That did not work out. In fact, manufacture in Canada diminished considerably, and most of it left the country. It was thought that the loss of the act would actually kill our generic company production of medicines as well. But interestingly, the Waxman Act of 1984 gave it an opportunity to thrive, not by producing medicines for Canada, but with the advent of the internet, we produced medicines through these companies for the United States. And while many attempts were made by legislators in the United States to try and control drug prices, and all of them failed under pressure from the companies, it was the Canadian supply of generics that managed to keep the lid off the crisis so that the system continues to this day. And now for both of our countries, the production of medicines and critical components have been outsourced to Asia. I'll also mention the failure in 2009 of the Chalk River nuclear plant, which was neglected to the point that it could not be saved, in that it resulted in a worldwide shortage of medical isotopes, which continues to this day. And it was the one area that Canada had been contributing to world innovation up to that period. Well, when the Prime Minister sought to invoke the Emergencies Act, he was met with a frosty reception. Premier Moe already let it be known that Saskatchewan was doing everything that the federal government could do, and they would vote against it. The teleconference went very badly, as you might expect, given the Prime Minister's description of the Emergencies Act. Premier Horgan dominated the conversation according to this report, and he said that he vehemently opposed the Emergencies Act, and the consideration was dropped at that time. It was briefly considered again in late of 2020 when the vaccines became available. Interestingly, at the first iteration, Premier Ford of Ontario said that he did not care whether Prime Minister Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act or not, so long as the province received the supplies that it needs for the pandemic. And I think Premier Ford actually understood the act better than the description given by the Prime Minister, in that it is designed to provide the supplies to the provinces and to the municipalities so they can meet their responsibilities and not to override their responsibilities. So that's where we are today. And we can maybe consider how we might have been if our drug supply had been under the national security protection. Why is Canada so far behind the United Kingdom and the United States in the vaccination rollout? Well, I think it's because we brought absolutely nothing to the table. Unlike our history that we have considered today, we had a complete failure of Indigenous innovation. This is not the government's fault. The responsibility lies with the universities and with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and with our Indigenous pharmaceutical industry. But we did not take part in a meaningful way in clinical trials either. This is another vital element to the development of programs such as vaccination. Health Canada is always slow in licensing medications. It seems to us as if they always wish to see how the medicines perform in another jurisdiction before they make the decision themselves. And in this case, even for emergency licensing, we were behind many other countries, in particular the United Kingdom. It is interesting that the license for the vaccines that we are currently using is an emergency licensing, and yet we have not applied emergency licensing surveillance programs. We have informal surveillance programs that are not sufficient to see any early signals of problems. We, because of our failure, have no understanding of the comparison between vaccines. We do not know how they perform in different populations because we did not undertake any clinical trials. And we have failed to figure out if these vaccines are compatible with one another, or indeed if you need to get booster doses, once you have had an infection with COVID-19 followed by a single vaccination. Almost certainly with the latter question, you do not need a booster dose. And almost certainly you can mix vaccines because we know this immunologically. But from the regulator's point of view, you can't because nobody has tested it and nobody has shown that it is possible. Finally, we've made no effort to understand when the patient is immune. And I think all of these questions would have been answered if we had considered our healthcare supply as a matter of national security. So when the pandemic is over, I think there are advantages to having our healthcare supply as being a matter of national security, because we would routinely then expect us to look at all of our medications from the perspective of the patient and innovate and test them from that perspective and not from the perspective of the manufacturing company that seeks to make a profit. We would integrate our regulatory system into our healthcare delivery system so that we would have a much better surveillance program. These opportunities are with us all at this time, and they would increase efficiency as well as improve our safety. Of course, we think of the national security with respect to healthcare supply to be able to make sure that the supplies will always be available to us. And this would require a combination of manufacture, importation, and storage. And it would allow us to do it at the most cost-effective, in the most cost-effective way. Most importantly, having our healthcare supply designated as a matter of national security would prevent profiteering. Instead of having the unregulated market that we currently use, where companies frequently go bust trying to innovate medicines in the hope that they hit the jackpot when they succeed. But I don't think it will be possible for us to undertake such a thing as making our healthcare supply a matter of national security using current legislation, because we are too focused on emergencies rather than national security as they are in the United States. So thank you again for the opportunity to present these thoughts, and I look forward to the discussion.
Vivian, there you are.
Thank you, Dan.
Up in Moose Factory.
Yes.
You've taken your tie off. You've taken your tie off. You've relaxed. Well done.
I would have worn it, Dan, but just taking the luggage up was a luxury I couldn't afford.
Understood. Wonderful presentation. Let me, if I may, just pose a couple of questions, and some of them are still coming online. So I will probably have a look at those as well. During your overview of Sanofi Pasteur, at the very end, you presented a sort of negative perspective in terms of the future. I mean, I'm not a specialist in this field at all. Is that company really the only major drug innovator and manufacturer that we have in Canada? And if so, why did you make that rather negative prognostication in terms of the future for that company? I'm just curious.
Well, Dan, there are others on this conversation who might chip in and have a better information for you than mine. In the talk, the reason why I chose and said that was I was really talking about Connaught Laboratories and their extraordinary history over nearly 100 years, which the future of which is entirely different. There will be a subsidiary and they will be servicing the needs of a company for different reasons, rather than servicing the need of the country or of worldwide eradication programs. Now, companies do get involved in these things, and I don't want to be completely negative about companies. No, there are many, many companies and many smaller companies and innovative companies in Canada itching to continue the work the type of work that was done at Connaught Laboratories. There are many of us in this field who regret the loss of Connaught Laboratories and wonder what it would have been like if we had built on it and it was now a multi-site place across Canada. But I mean, that's the past. So I'd leave it to others to contribute and say what other companies are doing. I wouldn't be entirely negative about it. And it was really for the purposes of the talk to tell you about Sanofi, but there are many other companies with action going on in Canada. And our goal, I think, is to stimulate them to be more innovative in Canada and for us to assist them in that and then trade with countries, with Europe and with the United States, so that we don't ever face this situation again.
Mm-hmm. Vivian, what do you think it would take to, in a sense, convert the issue into one of national security? Is this something that is a question of legislation, or is it really, as you spoke earlier on, sort of expanding the definition of what national security includes? So how would we get from where we are today to where you think we might be able to, where we should be in the future?
Well, Dan, there used to be a way to reply to those sort of questions in the Army and say it's above my pay grade. But, speaking as an armchair politician, this takes the will of the politicians, which will reflect the input from citizens. So I think it does take legislation. And I'm trying to say in the presentation that it requires us to take our emphasis away from emergencies. It's too late to respond to an emergency when an emergency occurs. This is a well-known problem in the Army. We never respond that way. And if you do, you get a very poor result. So you have to prepare for emergencies. So you have to take that into account. My personal preference is that it is a matter of national security, and we do need to modify our Emergencies Act into something much more aligned with the Defense Production Act of the United States. I think they probably got that right in comparison to us, but I'm not an expert. Maybe there are experts online who will contradict me or explain it in better than I can.
Right. It seems to be one of those issues that implicates a very strong relationship between the public sector and the private sector. We can think, for example, of, within defense procurement, for example, and the way in which D&D has to go about the business of procuring major capabilities, whether it's ships or aircraft or whatever, and the kinds of rules that they set up to ensure that those corporations adhere to not only their ability to produce capability, but also to adhere to different sorts of aspirational goals, within, for lack of a better term, social engineering. And I'm just wondering, is this seems to be somewhat similar in that it's not going to be the government per se that is producing these vaccines and these products. It is likely to be the private sector. Is that your view? And then how does the government engage the private sector in a meaningful way such that they are willing to make those investments, which I'm sure are in the multi-millions or billions of dollars, and also continue to produce? So what's your view on that issue?
No, absolutely. I mean, it would be irresponsible to convert our current drug supply chain into the procurement fiasco that the army faces or the armed forces face for many other things. No, provincial governments are well used to procuring, and in the healthcare sector, they're doing it all the time. So they procure everything basically for the healthcare sector, but mainly for in-hospital care. So they both build the hospitals, supply the hospitals entirely. So I think we do have a procurement system that doesn't necessarily have to get as bogged down as the procurement system for, say, our coastal ships or something like that for the Navy. The mechanism obviously is that the federal government has to ensure the supplies that are available to the provincial governments so they can meet their responsibilities. And that's, I think, the structure that we would have to have. Clearly, these are very difficult discussions, because the minute you say you will do something like that, you are going to require an expert panel. And now we've got one expert panel dealing with just the vaccine against COVID-19. Imagine expert panels dealing with every single medicine that we need. It's going to be very, very complex. And they decide which vaccines, at the moment, we do have a system to license medicine. So we do understand how to evaluate medicines and give them a license. And we do, and that's an ongoing license. They do have to supply reports to continue their license. It's not a one time for all type of license, but we would definitely need to extend that beyond what we currently license and look at value, look at how well these medicines perform and what's the cost effectiveness, what's the cost that we are prepared to pay. So for instance, if a small improvement occurs with a new medicine that has very little clinical change for the patients, is that worth thousands and thousands of dollars, as in many of the new medicines that we have to face with there? And these expert panels will say almost certainly not, that they will try and match the price for a new drug according to the extra benefit that you get from that drug. But this will require a great deal of expertise and a great deal of input and new structures. We do have similar structures, but they have to be developed considerably if you ever moved into a full situation where medicines were completely under national security. What I think we would have is a hybrid model where the bare bones medicines would be considered as vital, and we would ensure that there is a supply available for the provinces to be able to meet their responsibilities in delivering healthcare.
Okay. Over these past months, and we've seen how Canada has addressed these issues, are there other systems in other countries that you have looked at that potentially are models that we could emulate successfully?
You know what, Dan? I'm just looking at the chat there on the side, and I see Michael Reeder online, and he's a pharmacologist at University of Western Ontario. And I don't know if Michael will be prepared to talk. He actually knows a lot more about that particular question than I do. There certainly are expert panels in all the other countries and jurisdictions to look at value for medicines beyond just regulating safety for license. Maybe if we opened it up, we'd see if Michael and others would contribute those sort of answers. But they're great questions.
Sylvia, is that possible that you could have Michael come on the audio for us?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that I'm stuck.
That's fine.
Hello?
Hi,
Hello,
Mike.
Vivian.
Michael, you're there.
Vivian, Daniel, how are you guys?
Very well.
Excellent. How are you doing?
I'm good, working like a dog.
Good.
I think, first of all, amazing talk, great perspective, but I think you've nailed it on the head with respect to the problem with the Canadian system. So our healthcare system, part of the problem is we don't have a healthcare system. We have 14 of them. There's a little federal system, the 10 provinces, the 3 territories. So getting to work together is a problem. So that's one of the reasons why we underperform as a country compared to places like the UK, who spends way less on health, but gets better outcomes, which is, and you've worked in the NHS, as have I. And for all its faults, they actually produce better outcomes than Canada does, unfortunately. But Canada has a real hole in our drug process because we have a regulatory agency that approves it, Health Canada. They work according to their mandate, as you noted, often slowly. And then we have the provinces in CADTH and INIS, which are health technology agencies. But there's no one like the US have this group called CEDARS, which is Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. And the US has a group called NICE, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, which is a funny name for a group that's actually not very nice because they come up with, they're very hard-nosed in how they approach things. So those groups do exactly what Vivian says, which is they say, okay, you've got your brand new drug that costs, starts in a constant, ends in MAB and costs $80,000 a year, but it only provides a tiny increment. So I don't think we're interested in it. As opposed to saying, well, this drug actually saves lives, innovates, and brings forward. We should use it under these conditions in these patients. It's a big gap, and we see it now with the recommendations going forward. So for things like our COVID drugs and everything else, we have kind of that equivalent for vaccines, NACI, the National Advisory Committee on Immunizations, and they're pretty good for vaccines, but for pharmaceuticals, we're way behind. And you've identified as well, now that we globalize things, so the global supply chain has shrunk to a few companies, largely in Asia, producing bulk components. So when there's a bump in the supply, everybody suffers. And at one point, we were about a third of the drugs coming out of Asia, or out of India, were getting turned down by the FDA. Well, to imagine that's not going to affect the supply chain is fallacy. So we have a real problem with this in terms of how we regulate drugs and our domestic supply.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. That's insightful. Thank you. We're coming pretty much to the end of our time with Vivian. He's been kind enough to share his time with us tonight. Is there anyone else that would like to pose a question at this time? I would be happy to relay it. Okay. Well, let me remind you, I've had a couple of inquiries along the way that this presentation will indeed be posted to the RCMI YouTube channel. I do have another question here, as a matter of fact. I want to make sure I don't miss it. Actually, something, this is a good question, Vivian, if I may just take a moment of your time. Some of the history that I've been reading about pandemics, going back to the Middle Ages and going back to the 1919 flu pandemic, was how people reacted once the emergency was over. And you mentioned lessons learned. The history books seem to say that once the emergency is over, people want to forget about it as quickly as possible. Some people go absolutely mad because they're so happy, so we talk about the roaring 20s. We may well be talking about the roaring 2020s in the not too distant future. But the whole business of lessons learned is an important one. Who do you think ought to be responsible for capturing those lessons learned in Canada. Is that something that the federal government ought to be doing, the provincial governments, the private sector? How are we going to learn from this experience so that, as some people would indicate, there may be yet another pandemic around the corner because the fundamental conditions that created the pandemic in the first place have not actually changed? How do we capture these and capitalize on what we've learned through this experience?
Well, I don't think it's any individual institution's responsibility. It's every institution and every individual's responsibility, Dan. So, and although when we look back on history, it does look awfully like people forget the minute the emergency is over. But what is actually going on, I think the lessons were learned by them, but they didn't talk about it. In fact, it's fascinating that the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 1919 virtually disappeared at the middle of 1919, and nobody talked about it again. Although they must have learned from it. They changed the way they probably took care of themselves and took care of hospitals, took care of their work as federal government and provincial governments. So what we're really doing today is talking about it more than learning. And that's one of the ways you learn your lessons. I have no doubt that the government have learned the lesson. They are really seriously thinking at the federal level and the provincial level how they're going to collaborate to face not only pandemics and emergencies of the future, but actually the surge in requirement for new medicines that could bankrupt us if we don't take a positive or a forward-thinking approach to this. So the pandemic will be seen as a blessing. But when they look at our history 100 years from now, and none of us will be here to disprove me, they'll say we never learned a thing. We carried on as if it never happened. But I suspect we will. And we just probably won't talk about it. And if it's the roaring 20s, bring it on. I'm looking forward to them too.
I'm sure everybody who's on this Zoom call is feeling exactly the same way. Right. Let me end it there. Let me say that once again, your expertise as a physician and a researcher is quite evident. But I think what people now who have never been had the opportunity to speak to you previously or speak with you is now that they see not only your expertise in that field, but also that you are a very astute historian and also an astute and accomplished educator. And I think that being an educator is something that that we all value, because this is, as you say, how we learn and how we're going to go forward and how we're going to get beyond all of this. In addition to all of the other credentials that you have, the one I neglected to mention is, of course, it goes without saying that you're a member of the RCMI. I cannot at this moment offer you a drink at the long bar or offer you yet another tie, of which I'm sure you have a closet full. But the time will come indeed when I'm going to have that opportunity to do so. So I want to thank you on behalf of everyone who's online tonight, who's obviously very interested in your talk. I found it incredibly informative and quite useful. And as I said earlier, this will be posted to the RCMI YouTube channel so that other folks can have a look at this when it is more amenable to their own time. If I could as well, I would like to thank, as I usually do, Sylvia Lau for her behind the scenes expertise in making this whole event possible, and my colleague Eric Morse, who is busily running around doing something in his new apartment. But Eric is also a very important player in the RCMI as far as the communications aspect and the marketing aspect. So he's done a great job for us tonight as well. If I may, then let me end tonight by reminding you, if you have not yet seen our advertisement for our annual conference. As you know, we tend to have an annual conference in April. We are going to hold an annual conference this year on April the 20th at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, Eastern Standard Time. It will be a virtual conference, I'm afraid. I'm hoping we will have a live one next year, but it'll be a virtual one this year. And the subject matter is on the issue of climate change and Canadian national security and beyond. And we have 4 of the leading experts in this subject from Canada, from NATO, and from the United States. It will be about a 2-hour event, so it's somewhat longer than our normal speaker events, but I think it's going to be a very fascinating and very informative activity for you. The registration for this event is already online at rcmi.org, and I look forward to seeing you virtually, of course, at that conference on April the 20th. With that, Vivian, I'm going to sign off. I thank you once again. I wish you all the best in Moose Factory and your return back down to London when your responsibilities end. And I look forward to seeing you in person at the RCMI as soon as we can get together and hoist that gear. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Thank you for attending. And I wish you all a pleasant evening. Take care. Thank you.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.